Okay. Sorry, guys.
Hello.
Let's do that
Can you
again
hear
from
me?
the top.
Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Between Realities VR podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here with us. And hell, I'm excited to be here. You know, it's been 3 weeks, I think, since we have done an episode. We took a little bit of a break, did a little bit of traveling, but we are back and we are very excited to be back up and running. My name is Alex VR. I am co-host of the show, and I am joined here, as always, by my co-host, Skiva. Skiva, how you doing, dude?
I'm good, man. So today, I don't think it's any, I don't think there's any hiding that I'm a little sick. I got some con crud. So we're gonna do this, man. I'm ready. I'm pumped and I'm jazzed. So I'm excited to be back.
Yes, me too. You know, we are remote today. I think it's obvious because my arm is like reaching out of the frame and all of that shit. So we're remote today. You know, we both got sick in Los Angeles, or I mean, in Las Vegas,
yeah.
as well as like a million people. You know, we kind of knew that there was an opportunity for us to get sick going there, but I don't regret going. It was, I had an amazing time. I know Steve had an amazing time too, right?
I did, man. It was absolutely amazing. The connections that were made and the people that we got to hang out with and the tech we got to try were just worth everything, worth feeling like crap for a few days. So
yeah, it definitely was. But you know, I missed doing the show. And frankly, I missed you, you know, because I was super busy during the convention. You're busy during the convention. And, you know, I was in Michigan for a week before we went to Vegas. And now I've been basically a corpse for the past week, laying around being sick as hell and getting over everything. But I'm feeling much stronger with every day. And I think it's only a matter of time before we can put this part behind us and get back to crushing it and not feeling like shit.
Heck yeah, man. Let's do it.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, today is exciting. Obviously, we're back, right? We're here. We're doing another episode, which we love always. But I particularly love it when we are joined by today's guest. He is, in my opinion, one of the most forward-thinking and smartest dudes in the XR space. I know we're all very lucky to have him because, as you know, we are very aware of the implications of the technology that we all love, virtual reality. But not everyone's trying to be forward-thinking about it, right? A lot of people are just kind of blindly walking into the darkness, and it would help if we had some people out there who maybe tried to get ahead of some of these things, right? And think about how we can approach this emerging immersive technology ethically and morally and in a way that will make sense for all of us. So let's just get them on, right?
Heck yeah.
Please, everyone, welcome to Between Realities for the third time, Mr. Kent Bai. Hello, sir.
Hey, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me back, Alex and Skiva. It's great to just come back and talk about not only the potentials, but also the perils of the technology and what the ultimate potentials are, and also the philosophical implications, which is also, I think, an interest that we both share. So I'm excited to dig into all sorts of things today.
Me too. You know, it's like, I feel like I don't know. We love the philosophical implications of all of this stuff, right? And we love to think about all of the ethical stuff, but a lot of times I kind of just feel like, I don't know, like I'm just like some hippie stoner sitting in his backyard being like, oh man, this is so crazy, you know? And when I have you on, when we have you on and people like you, it kind of like maybe gives a little bit of like legitimacy to some of those thoughts that I have, you know? It's like, okay, maybe I'm not like so crazy for thinking all this, or maybe I'm not just high, you know, like maybe some of this stuff is actually really, really profound and really, really exciting and something that we really should be paying closer attention to. So thanks for that.
Yeah. I just wanted to give a shout out to David Chalmers' new book. It's coming out on January 25th. It's called Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. And you know, what I learned from, I read the book and had an interview with him, but one of the things that really stuck out was just how much these issues of virtual worlds kind of go back to like Descartes in 1641. And even before that, in terms of if there was some other women who were talking about these ideas of virtual demons. But he would all talk about, you know, what if our reality was being controlled by a virtual demon and all of our sense perceptions, then it would be kind of an illusionary reality. So since then, we've kind of been living in a philosophical context where if there is an evil demon controlling everything that you're thinking, then that's a fake and illusionary world. Now we fast forward until today, where we have viable consumer virtual reality technologies where we essentially have our senses that are being kind of tricked in some ways. And so there's a question as to, even in the scientific community, reference to those things as like the place illusion and the plausibility illusion and the virtual body ownership illusion, this illusionary language that is kind of establishing that there's a difference between what our experiences are in these virtual spaces. And it's kind of creating a lot of times these false dichotomies between what reality is and what the virtualness of it is. And what I think what Chalmers is trying to argue in this book is that we should, instead of saying that it's this contrast between the virtual and the real, and it's more of a contrast between the physicality and the virtual reality, and that they're both realities. They're both genuine realities, but there's still differences between those two. And so how do you navigate the differences between our physicality and the virtuality? And so, yeah, it's sort of, if we only say that what's real is the physical stuff of the world, then you start to get away from what our experience of that world is, which doesn't always have a connection to some sort of physical, tangible thing. It can be experiential or consciousness. So yeah, it's like, not to dig too deep into things, but
we're gonna
that's what comes up.
This is so good. Everybody, this is going to be a fucking awesome episode, because this is like I said, this is going to be an opportunity for us to get some of these like, whoa, dude, thoughts and like wrangle them in and like give something, put some fuel behind them, and kind of give some maybe like a scholarly perspective or a scholarly context to some of these thoughts. And maybe we can learn how to approach these subjects a little bit better, so we can continue to have important conversations that will hopefully lead to the right decisions being made. So hang in, everybody, because this is going to be amazing. And by the way, all of you who are joining us here live for this broadcast right now are amazing. We've got QUIKCOSPLAY. How you doing, QUIKCOSPLAY? Hope you're feeling so much better. I know that you'll be joining us back in VR very soon, so thanks for joining us. We've got D1360 VR. What's up, dude? Thanks for being here. Gamertag, pass the bowl. Come on, man. Come hang out. VR with Jasmine's here. Yes. Obscure Nerd VR. Yes. Our friends who we got to hang out with in Vegas.
Heck yeah.
So good to see you. Ashley Huffman, thanks for joining us from the Haptics Club. I just watched her Haptics Club on Twitter. She does Twitter Spaces, Haptics Club. Go check it out. Sweaty Nugget JJ's been here. Short Stack VR has been here. Chroma Snare, Angie McCown, you're on mute. Oh, thanks. We knew. We figured that out sooner. Mesh Eddie Cool, Mr. Survivor, Robin, hello. Jansen Fox. Dude, thank you guys all so much for being here. Dark Angel.
What's up? What's up, everyone?
Who am I missing? Anybody, Skiva?
Oh man, I think you got the majority. PD. I see some P Diddy in there.
Yet, you messed up. You got to get in early if you want to get that shout out. You got to say something. So thank you guys for being here and participating in the chat. So before we just dive down the rabbit hole, because once we go down, there's no coming back up. I'm surprised we actually made it back to the surface after that little intro spot. We were at CES, and I know Skiva has just been chomping at the bit to share some of his experiences from being in Vegas.
For real. We had such a good time, first of all. I mean, this conference is absolutely mind-blowing. For anyone that hasn't been to CES, you can't grasp how large this conference is unless you go there and see it, right? Because it takes up the entire Las Vegas Convention Center, which is many, many halls. You have to drive to each hall, right? But plus, then you have to go from hotel to hotel, where it takes up the entire convention center for like the Venetian and some other hotels. So it is absolutely massive, and it's full with some of the most mind-bending technology that really isn't even available to the general public yet, right? A lot of this stuff is concept stuff. A lot of it is on its way and it's coming, and some of it is available that you can buy now. But it's just phenomenal, and we saw some amazing things. We saw some stuff, for example, like a new haptic suit that is. Let me see. I get used to these buttons again. Jeez.
Man, come on.
I know, right? So I did an interview here, and if you guys haven't checked out our channel lately, there's an interview up on our channel for OWO which is a new type of haptic suit which uses electrostimulation to kind of zap your muscles, as opposed to like B-haptics, right, which we're all familiar with and we love. And it kind of stimulates your muscles and makes them contract, and it kind of zaps you, right? And it can simulate all kinds of feelings from bullet entries and exits out your back to being cut to just all kinds of wild stuff. And the closest thing to something like this is the Tesla suit, which we did also get to hang out with the Tesla suit people. Did an after party with them, and really got to connect with them a little bit and had a really good time. So, you know, if you want to learn more about this OO suit, it's really, really cool. Head on over to our channel maybe after this show, right? And check it out.
Have you worn the Tesla suit or the OO suit, the electrical?
I've done the Tesla suit at South by Southwest, and it did feel like when I tried it, like getting electrocuted. It wasn't a pleasant like experience.
No, it's not pleasant, is it? It hurts.
Yeah, just like getting shot would not be a good thing, right? Getting stabbed, all these feelings, definitely not a good thing. But they don't full on electrocute you for every single thing that happens, right? So like, you know, there's rain simulations where you just feel the trickle of the rain, and then you feel the water kind of running down you. It's really wild. It's really, really cool. You have to be bare underneath this shirt, right? Because it uses contact to your skin and stimulates your muscles. But it's really, really cool. And a Tesla suit's like $13,000, right? This OO suit is only like $450 is what they're trying to come out with this at. So
crazy and competitive price.
Right.
It's a really, really competitive price.
Right. So very, very exciting stuff that I was super, super excited to play with. And I know a lot of people that were there with us really, really liked this. You know, Thrill has been raving on about it. You know, VR Jasmine tried it, and Z-Storm and all these people, and everyone really, really seemed to enjoy it a lot. So
dude, I had a great time. I was laughing my ass off during the demo. Straight up. Like, it was really, really fun. But that being said, I am curious as to like how, if and how it will actually be successful, because it's like the only time I can imagine wanting that level of consequence for like getting hit is like in a training simulation where like it actually matters, you know, like whereas like you're trying to train someone in like an oil rig, and you know, when it blows up, it actually hurts. Like, pain is a pretty powerful teacher, so I can see it being a somewhat successful tool for training or teaching something. But like, I froze my ass off when I put that thing on. Those sensor pads are like, I don't know, like a gel sticky pad or whatever, and I was like shivering as I was zipping that thing up. So
that's funny.
And then of course it is uncomfortable when you do get electrocuted by this stuff, but it is a pretty real sensation. It's way closer to actually what it feels like to getting hit by a dart or stabbed, I imagine. I've never been stabbed, than something like the vibral tactile motors of the B-haptics vest. But of course, I do see that something like the B-haptics vest just making a lot more sense for a typical consumer.
Oh, for sure. But this type of tech is super fun, right? And it's the ground level of something more along the lines of a Ready Player One suit, something you'd see in a science fiction movie, right? So it's pretty cool. But what you were saying with pain is actually pretty funny, because when we did go to that Tesla suit party, we mentioned we had the guy actually, we put Z-Storm in this suit, right, as you see here on screen, and had them crank it up pretty high and see what he could take for his pain tolerancy. And it was really, really funny to watch Z-Storm games get electrocuted via the Tesla suit guys. And I'm sure they probably wouldn't be super stoked for us showing this, because I don't think they're really supposed to do this. But it was really funny. And as you see with Z-Storm's reactions here, this is very real. Like, he can't control his muscles when they crank this up and hit him with it. Like right there, he just punched himself in the head, right? I mean, so this is pretty serious stuff, and also very, very funny. So, but let's see, what else do we have here? So some of the other tech that we got to try out, I got to try out a couple of really, really cool headsets, like the Vario VR3 and also the Pico Neo 3, both using an Ultraleap hand tracker. Which is really cool because it uses a different kind of technology to track your hands, and you know, occlusion isn't quite what it would be on an Oculus Quest, for example. But these headsets were really cool to try. The Ultra Leap tech was really, really neat to try, because hand tracking has a very bright future in virtual reality, right? We like to think of, shooting guns and playing games with each other. But, that's only part of what virtual reality has to offer. We have training and work things, right? This is all going to be a very big part of what VR has in store for us. We also did get to see, as you see here on the screen, the Lynx, but unfortunately it was broken. I only got to film it, touch it, try it on, but it didn't actually work. So you are seeing the Lynx here up on the screen. But between that and the Vario XR3, for anyone that doesn't know what that is, that's a human retina resolution headset. There is no screen door. You can't, it is about the clearest thing you will ever see in VR, and it is wild.
Was it good or what?
It was unreal, dude. It was absolutely unreal. And I got to try the mixed reality, right? Where they obviously they have full color pass-through cameras, right? Where they bring through the real world. And then the objects that are in the real world are absolutely crystal clear. There's no sign of pixels anywhere. It's very, very convincing and very wild. And combined with the Ultra Leap hand tracking, it was a very surreal and wild experience.
Have you done this one, Kent? Have you put the Vario on?
Yeah, I've done both the Vario and the Lynx. When I went to AWE, I was able to try out a lot of the latest tech that was, also featured there at CES. And for me, the Lynx was a lot more impressive in terms of the mixed reality device than the Vario, just because the Vario has the cameras that are offset from your eyes, which creates a little bit of a proprioceptive disconnect between what you're seeing in the perspective versus what you saw in the Lynx. With the Lynx was a lot closer to your eyes, and it was much more convincing to see that through the Lynx. So yeah, I've seen a number of different things over the years, and there's always this kind of disembodied disconnection from my proprioceptive, sense. Like there's an offset, and it's difficult to know. But when you have that offset, it's kind of like a presence can often be a house of cards, and you can get used to it and you can adapt. But it can also be like, pulling out the bottom card and the whole stack falling down because you don't believe it's plausible because there's something that's a little bit off. And that was my experience with the Vario, at least, was that it was very high resolution, but you almost do a little bit better with the Lynx that's a lower resolution, but has less of that disconnect, but also has this more seamless transition between the virtual reality and the augmented reality with the Lynx.
Wow, and that bums me out. It bums me out even more that the Lynx was broken when I was there, because I really, really wanted to try it.
I got to try. I didn't get to do too much because I spent most of my time at the BHaptics booth at CES. But on the last day, they cut me loose for a couple hours, and I ran around and just did as many demos as I could. Mm-hmm. And I jumped onto the X-Tall, and I was able to look at the color pass through of the X-Tall 3, and it looked amazing. Like it looked like a high quality video of my hands. But to Kent's point, I still felt like there was like a serious disconnect, and I can get used to it and learn to interact with my environment. But I still think that probably has a ways to go as well before it delivers that sense of presence of me being in both spaces at once.
Well, let me tell you, so I did a full X-Tal demo where I got in an actual cockpit with a fighter pilot, with an actual guy, right? That was helping me fly this plane. And my experience was pretty moving, right? So what this thing does, I'm trying to just pull up some footage here because I didn't have that one ready for some weird reason. But what I did was I got inside of a fighter pilot cockpit, like a full blown motion simulator dealio, right? And and the headset has a pass-through system, right, that is able to cut out some of the real world and put partial VR and partial mixed reality in, right? So I got in this cockpit, and the cockpit I was seeing and all the switches and buttons were real, right? And they were right there built in front of me, and I could flick switches, and I could grab the yoke, and I could see my hands, and I could look next to me, and I could see my co-pilot, but everything else was wide field of view, high definition virtual reality. And wow, man, that was one of the coolest experiences in VR that I've had.
Nice.
Period. Right. I mean, it was wild, but I mean, this isn't something, even if you bought an Xtal 3, right, for over 10 grand, and you brought it home, you're not going to get this experience because this had a super expensive 6DoF motion rig, you know, with a full cockpit built into it and all the controls, as you can see here on the screen, right? So this is a pretty serious thing, but what they use this for obviously is training pilots. So to a lot of different companies, this is absolutely worth it, right? Because they're actually able to rack up air miles while training in virtual reality without the risk of crashing planes and destroying equipment and hurting people, right? So this is kind of a big deal, and the way it was able to blend VR with real life was in track as I'm moving and track where the object was in real life compared to what it should be showing me in virtual reality was absolutely unreal.
Nice.
And this just showed me really that our future in this technology is so unbelievably bright, with companies like the VR engineers that are able to make all of this stuff, right? They're not even using custom, they're not even using Fresnel lenses like you would get that a lot of companies buy from mass production places to put on their headsets. They have created the lenses by themselves. They have done a lot of this technology by themselves because it doesn't exist anywhere else. So, so it was really cool. So I could see where like the typical mixed reality might not be as cool, right? But when you pair it with showing only specific items and blending it with the rest of the world being virtual reality, it melted my brain a little bit. It was really neat.
Hell yeah.
So
That's great, man. And something that you said before we started the show today was that like it is amazing to be able to go to these conventions and to try all this hardware, to meet the people who do all these things, and to kind of get a glimpse into the future as to where things are going. But at the end of the day, we really do go for the people.
Yes,
like it was
absolutely
so great to see so many familiar faces in the VR community, and we saw so many of them. Like I almost don't want to start listing people's names off because I don't want to forget anybody, but there's like so many incredible people who are here in the chat who we got to see in Vegas, and it was phenomenal. Absolutely.
And maybe we can, here's a quick picture. We threw an after party on Friday night after the convention was over, and it was absolutely amazing to just be able to connect a little more with some of these people, right, that we interact with on the internet all the time. But there's just something so much more bonding, if you will, about face-to-face time with some people, right? I mean, we hung out all night with Thrill Seeker and Fia and V-Bunny Go and Hambone and VR with Jasmine and Sweeviver and Genghis VR and Z-Storm Games and Kevin Henderson of Pimax and David Heaney of Upload VR, Obscure Nerd Andy, Jansen Fox, Vivian Chazin, Eric of Virtual Strangers and QTC, the Haptic Solution Cilia team, Danny Rayleigh. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's absolutely insane. And we just had a fucking blast. Like we really did. It was so amazing. And we got to connect and really solidify a lot of these relationships, right? And, and just throughout the entire conference. The entire conference was all about meeting and connecting with people and building those relationships, right? So that's what the important part is.
Honestly, I absolutely live for it, and it's like I feel like that's been the case ever since I first started going to conventions. And I tell this story often, but when I went to OC6, I was running around with a microphone trying to connect with as many people as possible. And there was one person who I noticed was running around with the microphone harder than me, and it was this guy right here, Kent Bai.
Yep.
I didn't know who he was at the time, but I did see him with his microphone in about 20 to 30 different faces. Just like he'd be like sitting Indian style in the corner of a hallway with the microphone in like Nathan's face, like at an after party or something. Like Kent, you were everywhere. And you've just recently celebrated 1,000 published episodes of the Voices of VR podcast. So congratulations for that. What's even more mind-blowing for us is that we know that there's maybe twice that many recorded interviews waiting to be published, which is like almost staggering to even think about. But I mean, I'm sure you can share our sentiment when it comes to connecting with people in real life at events like this.
Yeah, well, the Voices of VR podcast was really born out of the very first, consumer gathering, resurgence of VR back in May of 2014 at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference and Expo. This was the 1-year anniversary of the SVVR meetup, and they wanted to bring the community together. And I went there and did like 45 interviews with people because I wanted to just capture this as a moment in history that I just felt that was destined to be like a revolutionary new technology. And I've attended somewhere between 70 to 80 physical events over the last 7+ years. And then well over 100 if you include all the virtual ones as well. And so, yeah, I think there has been I would say the golden era of the conferences were from 2014 to 2019, the very beginnings of 2020. Sundance was the last one that I really went to. And then Augmented World Expo was the one that I picked up again. But I think it's a different time, like it's in a different phase where most of I attended CES in 2017. And my sense was that even though there was a lot of technologies from independent companies, either they're going to be acquired by one of the big companies or they would going to kind of shutter and we'd never hear from them again, or they'd be from a completely different ecosystem like in China, which is a whole other world where I think when I'm not as interested in CES anymore just because it is on the bleeding edge of consumer tech. And it's a little bit of like, if it's successful, then it'll probably end up at other places like Augmented World Expo or something that I might end up going to. But CES on the scale of it is just kind of, unreasonable in some fashion because not only do they have all of the different places, but they also have companies that don't feel like paying for the spots. And so they have you go into the hotels and check out stuff. But looking back historically, a lot of those more often than not don't end up surviving. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not they're going to be able to make a play. There was a time period when the Oculus was showing there, and it was like a period where there was a lot of explosions. But since then, I think it's the technology has kind of settled down where now it's haptic peripherals and augmented reality glasses. But we have the big players that are going to be coming out with a lot of those things. And so yeah, you get a sense of the technology, but also the big players also end up pulling out of some of these places like as well. So you don't get to see like their latest gear or what they're up to. But yeah, I think my journey into VR was to going to these different places and then capture a little bit of that oral history. And the episode 1000 is a way of kind of taking a look back to look at the full breadth and scope of what people are doing within the virtual reality technologies.
Right. So when you started, at SVVR, you're like, hey, this is an important moment. These are important people, potentially. I am going to do my best to just capture this, almost like freeze frame this moment so people can kind of go back and relive through that. Has that kind of been your goal of the Voices of VR podcast now? Like as you're hitting, 1,000 episodes, I heard like 1,600 or 1,700 interviews or something like that. Like, is that still kind of your goal, just to like capture it? Or do you find that you are trying to accomplish more as a result of what you're doing?
Well, I think the method that I would have would be very embodied in terms of going to these places and seeing what is arising. And so it's when you go to events like this, you kind of hear the zeitgeist, you feel a zeitgeist that is moving, especially if there's a critical mass of the industry that's there. So it's capturing that, but also like there's questions around experiential design, like how do you create experiences and what is the full range of different experiences and the different ways of understanding that. And I think that my approach was to try to see a diversity of those different things to get like a foundation experiential design to say like, what is the medical going to be adding to the experience? What is the educational context? What is the training context bringing in? So you have different, phases of like an idea that's proven out academically. You have the enterprise applications, and then you have the consumer context. But in order to get to that consumer context, it has to go through all these variety of different types of enterprise context. And so, part of my strategy was just to see all those different contexts and have as many different experiences as I could to try to boil down like an experiential design framework to understand, okay, this is what we're taking from biometric data, from, brain computer interfaces and neuroscience from the medical field, and then the gaming context. And then, so there's a fusion of all these different design disciplines that has been happening. So that was a big part of it is that, from everybody who's kind of sufficiently advanced in their own industry, if they're thinking about VR, they're trying to figure out and maybe have a unique perspective that we've never seen before as these different people from different, backgrounds come in. So a lot of it has been to kind of document that and to see these different things emerge based upon that just embodied practice of showing up at these places and to talk to the people who were there to find these deeper trends. But I think over time, there's also like more of a philosophical take in terms of what this all means, what the ultimate potential is, where is this going, what can we do with this technology, what are the limits, and what are the more ethical considerations. Starting in 2016, in April of that year, Upload VR had reported that one of the things with Oculus was reporting back, and it was not sure what type of data they were sending back, and so Upload wrote an article. Senator Al Franken got involved, and then started to question Oculus. What are you doing in terms of privacy with these new technologies? And I think at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference 2016, there was a buzz about like the hallway conversation was all about, oh my God, this technology could have all these really scary ethical implications. And so that's when the privacy track just sort of organically emerged from the community. And then as I was discussing it, it ended up being a really intractable problem about what are we going to do with the future of these technologies and how they're going to be encroaching in our privacy. And like I had mentioned to you, there's this film on Netflix called Don't Look Up, which is all about like this allegory of a comet that's coming and is going to destroy all the Earth. And there's these scientists who are kind of trying to warn the public that there's this big comet that's going to destroy everything in the world. And the kind of larger media ecosystem and also the political ecosystem doesn't really sufficiently respond to this challenge. And so sometimes it feels like that when talking about like privacy in XR, because it feels like this comet that's like hurtling towards us, and in some ways we're kind of sleepwalking into a dystopia with not really having protections for how we're going to prevent this from happening. If we change nothing, then it's almost inevitable that we're going to be living into a future that's going to be really dystopic. And so when I wake up in the morning or at the beginning of the year, I feel like this unsettledness in my stomach that despite having conversations about this for 5.5 years, there's still no real good solution to this as a problem. And we still are kind of like sleepwalking into dystopia. So that's a big part of, the part of it, but there's other things about like Sundance Film Festival and going and looking at all those experiences and seeing what the artists are doing and seeing what the creatives are doing. If there's any one thing that I'd say is a consistent thing, it's to listen to the artists and see where the artists are taking the medium and to see what's coming next by seeing what the kind of artists who are on the cutting edge, what they're thinking about the medium and what they want to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And, it's like, I kind of feel like, XR privacy and Kent Buy are kind of like these like synonymous things at this point, I feel like if the conversation comes up that like your contributions to the space at this point are already pretty well, seen and well respected. What I think is really cool about kind of where you found yourself in this situation is that like you're using the analogy of a comet. I'll use one of like an impending army, like let's say we know that we're about to be invaded by an army, and like there could be people like Skiva and I who can hear you talking about that army and are like, okay, yes, let's fight then. Like we'll fight, but like we don't know how to fight, like we don't have the tools, we don't have swords and shields, and we don't even know what an opposing army looks like. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of what you do is kind of give people like training courses for that battle a little bit, like I feel like you're kind of trying to create the groundwork for us to approach these situations and like almost teaching us how to think about these things as they start to unfold. Does that sound close to kind of the position that you found yourself in?
I think what I found, yeah, I think what you're correct in the sense of my goal is to try to create some sense-making frameworks to help tell a larger story so that you can see a picture and to kind of understand the different dynamics. But the process of getting those pictures have involved like hundreds of conversations and trying to kind of get to the gist of these different dynamics. Like as an example of that's probably the most clear. In 2018, there was a kind of a privacy summit that I helped co-organize with Jessica Outlaw and Philip Rosedale and Jeremy Bailenson. And so Stanford High Fidelity, and then, two independent folks with myself and Jessica, we brought together 50 different people from the VR industry. And we wanted to basically come up with a Bill of Rights for privacy. And so I think the idea was that if we just get everybody in the room and talk about it for like 6 to 8 hours, we'll be able to kind of, sort this out and figure out a good direction. And what the outcome was that like privacy is so contextually dependent that to even come up with a comprehensive definition of what privacy is and what it means, and that's a universally generalizable framework for privacy, that, that doesn't exist. In fact, then I eventually went to the American Philosophical Association Eastern meeting in 2019, and Dr. Anita Allen is widely regarded as one of the founders of the philosophy of privacy. And her keynote was that there is no comprehensive framework for privacy. And I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. Like, here's like the philosophical community who's supposed to be, at the forefront of understanding what these problems are and giving us some higher level conceptual frameworks. And even one of the founders of philosophy of privacy is saying that we don't have a comprehensive framework for this yet. And so what's that mean? It means that there's companies like Meta and folks that are on the front lines, Google and all these other companies, that kind of have to use an outdated idea of privacy from like 1973 of the Fair Information Practice Principles, meaning that privacy is defined as your control of information. And as long as we tell you what we're going to be recording and kind of what we're going to be doing with it, then we're all cool. So then you have these adhesion contracts that you sign in, and you basically give over all your rights to basically say you can do whatever you want with this data because we want access to these cool toys. But on the other side of it, you lose all your rights to that data. And it's sort of like a settler colonial mindset of kind of seizing all that data and then using it for however they want. You have no recourse as to understand what's appropriate use of that information or not. So what ends up happening is that then they're modeling our identity. They're potentially, getting to the point of understanding what's happening inside of our mind with a violation of our mental privacy, modeling that identity, and then potentially creating context and situations where they're going to nudge our behaviors and potentially undermine our agency and our kind of our right for intentional actions to make choices. So what's happened is that there's layers of like international law of saying like we need to create these fundamental human rights of neuro-rights that establishes our fundamental rights to identity, our fundamental rights to mental privacy, our fundamental rights to agency. And there's some other ones that they have in terms of right and equal access to the technology, as well as to be free from algorithmic bias. I'd sort of put those to the side to say that those are more of the ecosystem issues, but there's specific neurotechnologies that are going to be encroaching onto these aspects of what we're thinking about, modeling our identity, and that's going to be very contextually relevant, and then potentially nudging our behaviors. So you have the human rights, and then you have the US federal privacy law that we don't have, that is sort of very fragmented, that is using this outmoded way of thinking about privacy from 1973. Also, the way they conceive of privacy legally is that it's about your identity, so who you are. So it's about that information leaking out, getting into the wrong hands, and that person figuring out who you are. So it's all tied to this sort of static idea of who you are as an individual, whereas we're moving into a world where it's much more about this contextually relevant information, where they understand everything that's happening in that world, and they're watching all of your micro expressions and little transactions and your behaviors and your movements and your emotional, what you're feeling, and then what you're even thinking potentially, and then your muscle contractions, all this being fused together to come up with a very fine-grained, contextually relevant model for what you're thinking and what you value moment to moment. It's much more contextually relevant. And then with that digital twin they're creating, and then you're in these situations where you may have your privacy undermined. So as you start to even lay this out, there's layers of the culture, there's layers of the laws that need to be set, there's a layer of the market dynamics, and then eventually your user experience and the tech architectures that are driving that whole loop. So it's to understand how all those things play together is sort of like to understand kind of the sociological and the technological, and this dilemma, which is that we kind of let the innovation happen. You stand back. You don't put any policies too soon because you don't want to stifle innovation. So you let things run free, and then all of a sudden it's too late, and this technology is out there, and there's no way to control it because the culture is already kind of fully ingrained in this new reality. So that's kind of like privacy ends up being like a way to kind of map out all these different relational dynamics at different scales, and to know how to tie together the human rights and the cultural aspect to the legal aspect of what the government needs to do, the market dynamics of what needs to be left up to, say, Apple versus Meta versus the architectures of homeomorphic encryption and everything else. All those things have to like be a cohesive strategy, and at this point, there doesn't seem to be any cohesive strategy, or maybe we can start with a story of me saying all this. But then at the end of the day, where do you start to then fight back to be able to actually implement some of that?
Because, I mean, you know, it sounds like we have so far to go in this. And it almost seems like the technology is moving at a way faster rate than our ability to define privacy. You know, like we're sitting, like you were kind of talking about privacy, like originally having this like old school perspective of like my privacy is my identity. So it's like, as long as what I'm doing is anonymous, then technically I'm private kind of situation. But then we're moving into this world where like all of your actions and all of your, like you said, intentions and like the subtleties of the things that I choose to scroll past, or the things that I stay on and how many times I click at, like that information is now becoming what we're choosing to define as privacy, a little bit less so than, you know, my name and address, so to speak.
But you know, but it's also all tied to us, right? And this is one of the things that Meta and Facebook does, is they build profiles on us with our identities, right? It's not really anonymous stuff anymore. It's tagged to our physical and actual identities, and it's placed into databases, and it's sold off to the highest bidder, which is kind of wild. It's literally like selling your soul. So you know, like so there's a couple ways I think the general public deal with this, right? There's people like us who talk about it. We yell about it. We try to let people know that these things are happening. Then there's the other part, which are like, well, we're not going to worry about it because the things we're getting are amazing, right? And like you were saying, Kent, we a lot of times will ignore the problems because we're given such a cool toy, right? And then there's kind of everything in the middle. But you know, I've often said that I almost wish I almost wish that it wouldn't evolve so fast and we can figure these things out. And it took another 10 years for VR to get to where it is today, right? And I know that's a very unpopular opinion, but I'm also more about us as people, right? Because someday Zuckerberg isn't going to be running that company. He can only live for so long. Someone's going to come in with their own agendas. They're going to buy Facebook. They're a publicly traded company. They're going to have to sell it if a big enough offer comes in, right? But either way, Mark gets hit by a bus tomorrow. What happens, right? But it's all of these companies coming in, and they are pushing VR as well, not because they think it's the next big thing. Technically, it is, right? But they want to collect the data. This is very profitable and amazing information that they're able to gather about us and store in databases. And companies like Apple, $3 trillion company, getting into virtual reality, right? Because we are valuable, and what we do and how we think and how we move and what we look at, that's all very, very valuable. So like, how do we go about starting to combat this, right? I like what we're doing now, right? We're having conversations and we're having people listen to these conversations. We're trying to help educate the masses to what is happening behind the scenes. But where, you know, what more do we do? What do you think?
Yeah, well, this is the big, you know, $60,000 question, or how much ever, $60 million question now, I guess. But there's, you know, when I look at it, I look at, say, Lawrence Lessig's, where he's trying to, you know, his pathetic dot theory that he calls it, which I don't think is a great name, because it's essentially ways in which that you can make shifts and change in the world. And there's the culture, and then there's the laws, and there's the market dynamics and the economy, and then there's the underlying technological architecture and the code. And I think it's a good framework to start with, because you're right in the sense that the most power that we have in being able to even have these conversations is the culture. And the culture feeds into the different types of laws that we have. And those laws set the context for what the rules are for the economies to exist. And then from there, you have the technological architectures, which is kind of like the last stop, the last gap, to be able to have protection, but that it's all within the context of a cultural system, a legal system, and an economic system that any of these technical architectures are being built. So because of that, I feel like there's a lot of movement that's happening within human rights and trying to establish these neuro-rights as like a new human rights framework to say, hey, we should have these general principles that we should have this right to identity, right to mental privacy, and right to agency, which, at that point, it becomes a philosophical question to then like, do we have free will, and how do you define this? And how do you translate these concepts of like, say, the right to agency into something that would be implementable in a context of a law that could be enforced in any reasonable fashion? How do you know that? How do you define some of these things in terms of like that are age-old philosophical questions as to whether or not we even have free will? And how would you then translate that into this, what that line is for what things are going to be unethical? When I talked to Jonathun Burkhart, the way he phrased it, I thought was really interesting. He said, we know that like there's a lot of benefits from this technology of being able to track all this information. You can imagine a situation where you're trying to hack your consciousness and become a better person, right? And so there's a lot of the ways that you could use this information to make yourself a better person. There's also ways for that information to kind of cross a line and for them to be used in a way that is unduly mapping you and understanding you perhaps better than you understand yourself, to then create these situations and contexts that are nudging your behaviors to be able to then subtly undermine your deliberate intentional actions that you're taking into the world. And so how do you define that line, and how do you know once that's crossed, how do you explain that? And how would you put that into a law that was then being able to be enforced by either an oversight committee? The Federal Trade Commission is the thing that really is looking at privacy issues, but this is kind of like we're living in the aftermath of not doing anything around all of this kind of profiling that has been going on for years and years and years and years. So it's already at the point where they're literally doing all these things I'm talking about, like profiling us and, capturing our identity. And so then it becomes a matter of like, how do you address this? Is this like a, Dr. Anita Allen has this more paternalistic approach about identity, but there's also this concept that it's a human right. That's like, if we treat privacy like it's an organ, that would mean that you would not be able to sell your organs to get access to technology. The libertarian approach of thinking about privacy is that it's your data that you own and you can do whatever you want with it. It's your sovereignty to be able to, it's your choice to be able to enter into these adhesion contracts with these companies to make these different types of choices. But then the question becomes like, should we have these markets? Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism is saying maybe we should outlaw this type of surveillance capitalism, because there's a lack of fiducial relationship that's happening between, like, a good metaphor for what that means is like when you go to a doctor and you give information to your doctor, the intention for that exchange of that information is that they're going to help, that doctor is going to help you heal for whatever ailment that you have. But imagine if that doctor is then taking that information and then selling it to an insurance company so that your insurance or provider could deny you coverage for the health that you're getting. That's essentially what's happening with surveillance capitalism, is that there's no fiduciary responsibility for you as an individual. The company could take that information and profit however they want to. And there's no sort of oversight to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't take this information that is kind of medical information that you can determine lots of different medical rights about you can detect a lot of diseases or whatnot from VR information. So what's preventing Meta from selling that information from insurance companies to prevent people from getting medical coverage? Well, as of right now, there's absolutely nothing that's preventing that from happening, because there's no kind of universal approach for how to address these type of things from a, like GDPR is like a uniform approach for trying to address this kind of issues of personal data. But even GDPR is really focused on identity. And we're, like we've been talking about, we're moving what Britton Heller talks about is this concept of biometric psychography. So there's a new class of data that has never been defined before by the law that needs to be defined to be able to encompass all of this biometric and physiological data that is kind of getting away from this concept of only focusing on the personally identifiable information. So information that would be able to identify you as an individual. That is in some ways thinking about it as your identity is a static concrete object that's immutable, and we should prevent any leakage of that data that's going to allow people to discover your immutable identity of who you are. Now, we're moving into a world that's more I think, process relational in terms of like you're in the context and there's information that is relevant to that context. And as long as they're aware of that context, they're going to be able to extract all of these kind of movements and what you're looking at and your behaviors to be able to then extrapolate that into a model of your character, of who you are, what your likes are, your preferences, that then kind of put into this, big target on your head in terms of allowing you to be targeted by these different ads. So to figure out how to get in at any one of these areas and to not only philosophically understand the concepts that are at play, but then to then make that next leap, which is to define a law that would then prevent us from kind of sleepwalking into a future where that line, when we know that it's going to be really bad when they cross over it, but to define that line and to understand what it looks like when you cross that line is a part of this kind of larger ethical dilemma that we don't have the conceptual frames to do it. So it ends up becoming a matter of philosophical ways of defining that and mapping that problem out. And then from there, how to translate that into the laws. So that's the challenge, is that we can sort of intuitively know that this is going to be really bad, but then there's you can't just sort of base all the laws upon, someone's intuition. It has to be, explicated in some way.
So what fixes, and I know this is a rhetorical question at first, right? But so what fixes it? Like, what percentage of the population needs to have that philosophical perspective and that ability to first understand the question or understand the issue philosophically before enough people care? What is it? Do we need to have like a majority, or do we just need to have like a small, like a super squad with you and a bunch of other philosophers and people who like give enough shits to like really dedicate enough time to like providing that framework in a way that will make sense to these companies, or do people have to get pissed off enough in order for the riots and like groups of protests, like, is there a tipping point where we can see a difference and almost can secure our privacy and our safety?
Well, this is a larger problem that's been identified. It's called the technology pacing gap, and also the Coleridge dilemma. The technology pacing gap means that the technology is exponentially increasing to the point where it's hard to have those conceptual frames to figure out how to intervene. And so that's it was defined in 2011, and it's accelerating. So it's a larger issue that goes above and beyond what we're talking about here with XR. But there's also like the larger political context of what we have in the United States, which is essentially an extremely polarized dynamic where, you could argue that one side doesn't want democracy at all and the other side does. And then we're basically in a stalemate where there's no meaningful legislation that's actually happening. So in some ways, our extreme polarization within the political context of the United States has created a situation that is kind of like heaven for any of these tech companies, because there's no short-term outlook that any sort of legislation is going to pass anyway. So they can just kind of do whatever they want. But even if you did solve that problem at the political level, that you did have a functional democracy that was actually passing laws, I think probably the European Union is a lot better of a model like that, because they were able to pass something like GDPR to be able to protect our privacy. And they go beyond just the sort of the dyadic, left versus right. It's more of a triadic and in fact multi-stakeholders, where there's lots of different groups that are involved in forming the laws and passing the laws that then get adopted by each of these different countries. So in some ways, the metaphor here in the United States is that the states have the ability to do that. If there's not a federal privacy law, then each state has the ability to pass their own law. So you've seen a fragmentation of, California and these other, Illinois has a biometrics law that's, doesn't go as far as it needs to go in terms of the, biometrics from VR. Again, it's all tied to identity, but you have the states that are able to do the different types of ways of figuring out what those laws are. I think eventually what I expect happening, at least in the short term, is that artificial intelligence is a lot more mature as a technology, in the sense that there's a lot more policy discussions that have been happening around how to regulate AI and these types of algorithmically driven algorithmic bias and whole other range of different ethical issues around AI. And there's probably the best chance for something like the Neuro-rights to be established would be through like the European Union discussions around artificial intelligence, to be able to kind of maybe Trojan horse some of the different stuff that's going to be more forward looking in terms of where the immersive technologies are going, so that in the context of AI, something gets passed in Europe that then forces the hand of Meta to create new architectures that maybe even change their business model at some point. I don't foresee in the next 5 or 10 years to see any significant change in the political dynamics of the US. And the reason why that's important and why the US law is important is because that's where a lot of these companies are based. So the way that their home laws are set dictates how they operate around the world. So that means that if the US law is very open and liberal, that means that they can basically do the worst types of architectures that you can possibly imagine, and they can export that to other countries. Unless they, like Chile just passed, a Neuro-rights in their constitution, and it's for me, it looks maybe a little bit toothless in terms of how they're able to actually put something in, like, imagine if the U.S. Modified our constitution to say that you shouldn't be able to violate our brain data. And basically it's trying to establish neuro-rights at the level of the constitution. But even at that, even if we did that, there's still like a clause in there that says that except for if people consent. So even in the way that the consent works is that if people consent to do that, then that even if you pass something in the Constitution, it's not going to change it. So this has been like trying to trace down like what's the approach that's going to be the thing that you can do. But it really has to be like the whole academic community producing literature to say these are the dangers and the harms that are going to be done, to be able to then present that to the legislators to do forward-looking legislation, doing legislation before the harms are done. And to say this is going to be such a risk that we need to preventively pass legislation, which has not been the historical standard of how legislation gets passed, to do it and to potentially constrain that innovation. But we're talking about data that used to be classified as medical data. So there used to be very tightly controlled around that. But we're moving into a consumer context where it's basically making all this really intimate data available for anyone, not only just these companies like Meta, but a third-party developer could have access to all this stuff. And so you have to think about that. Not only is this being available, like made available in the context of like, say, all the evils of surveillance capitalism, but you're also, there could be a rogue developer that somehow gets information. Thankfully, I think a lot of the third-party developer contracts are preventing some of that information to getting into the hands of the third-party developers, which then asks a very interesting question. If Meta is so afraid of some of this data getting into third-party developers' hands, then why aren't we offered those same protections as consumers? Because take a look at their third-party developer and what the third-party developers are and are not able to do, and then go back and look what Meta are able to do. And there's a pretty significant gap in terms of the type of stuff that they're making available for themselves, but not making available for everyone. So I think it's good that it's there, but it's also illustrating the fact that there's a lot of ways in which that data could be used for harm that there's no real good way to protect it. So it's a multifaceted. It has to be the culture and the education, the research. It has to be us talking about it. It has to be a human rights layer and the ethical design frameworks that are more soft law. And then we need new laws that are being able to translate these. And we need responsible innovation programs that are viable, that actually have a connection between innovation that's stage gated and in dialogue with the audience and the general public, to talk about some of these harms and to release them slowly rather than to kind of unleash them onto the public and to kind of like move fast and break things when breaking things involved all these, with these neurotechnologies, it could be that we should really think closely in terms of like what type of ways are we going to prevent this, either at the cultural level, the legal level, and the market. Each of these companies have their own philosophies around responsible innovation. Meta happens to be a very much a whitewashing or an ethics washing approach, meaning that they say they're doing ethics, but they're not really. They'll say, we're talking to experts and we're consulting to experts, but they're actually ignoring a lot of what those experts are saying. They just want to be able to say, oh, well, we're consulting experts in a way that they're checking a box saying that we've we've sort of filled our obligations of all the ethical and moral responsibilities because we've talked to an expert, by which then we ignore completely everything that they told us, but at least we consulted to them. And then at the last sort of defense are these things at the technological architecture level. So are there technologies like homeomorphic encryption or differential privacy that are going to make a difference, or not, because they're going to still have access to the information tied to our identity. So even if they have this kind of business level, some of those architectures are more designed to prevent if the data were get out into the wrong hands, that they would protect you from being identified rather than the type of biometrics tracking that they would have otherwise. So it's an issue, like privacy is an issue that like maps out all these dynamics, and I can sort of explain all those things, but then to translate all that into a law is sort of like the big open question for how to make that into something that's going to actually have teeth and legs and create a situation where we don't have to wake up afraid that we're going to be exploited for the rest of our lives with these immersive technologies.
Right. Skiva, did you have something that you wanted to throw in here?
Oh, I found it funny that we were talking about how Meta kind of has their own rules for what they're allowed to do, but the devs can't, utilize those same rules. It's kind of like, it even kind of trickles down to us, right? I want to see the playtime on some of the games I have on my Quest, and I can't see my own data, but Meta can see it all.
Right.
But I'm not allowed to see what I do. And that's pretty messed up when you really think about it, right? And we're at a place right now where brain-computer interfacing, like we were talking about, it's on its way. Valve has components coming out this year. Meta has like wrist strap devices to be able to read where your fingers are going to be and to start to guess of where they're going to be in a couple milliseconds, right? There's a lot of interesting BCI technology that's coming really, really fast. And I feel like we're kind of in a race, right? The tech companies are thinking like, we got to get this out before this legislation and any of these laws are able to be formed and passed, right? Because if we can get this stuff out, we can get it to the general public, we're kind of dodging a lot of these bullets, and we're setting a precedence for the future right now. Meanwhile, we have a lot of really old people in the government that don't understand the technologies that they're responsible for setting laws for. So we're in a little bit of a strange predicament here. And I don't know, that's what I kind of wanted to throw in there.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think it's really important too, to kind of reiterate here that like, I really don't think that what we're talking about here is like tinfoil hat conspiracy kind of shit, like I think there's a lot of people out there who kind of are like quick to just brush this off because it sounds like that's an uphill battle, and this is going to be we're basically fucked anyway, like there's not a whole lot we can do, and whatever, they already have my data. I hear a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, this company does it, and this company does it
as seriously as we're kind of taking it in this conversation. Kent, what would you say to someone who kind of gives you some pushback like the examples I just gave?
Well, I wanted to maybe embody to steel arm the some more skeptical perspectives, because I think there are, in order to really come to a firm like approach, you do need to have the contrary perspectives. And so I'd say that Cory Doctorow is somebody who's been articulating the more skeptical take on surveillance capitalism. And so what he is saying is that, look, these companies of Meta, Facebook, like whatever you want to call it, like in the history of when Meta was Facebook, they were lying a lot about their views. They're overstating what they're able to do with the technology, but they can't really understand what we're thinking. They can't model us. Us as humans, we're not mathematical entities. We can't be modeled to that degree. And even if they could, it would be a historical model. It wouldn't be what we want to do in the future. So there's kind of and I agree with the sense that we're not mathematical entities that are deterministically going to be able to be modeled in their past behaviors and to understand what we're going to be doing in the future. And I like first of all, I don't think that Cory Doctorow specifically is up to speed with all different things of like what the future of neurotechnologies and brain-computer interfaces and the Control Labs EMG. When I talked to Thomas Reardon, who was the director of neuromotor interfaces for what was the time Facebook Reality Labs research. So what they're emphasizing is that they're able to detect the firing of individual motor neurons. And they're thinking, well, it's like hand movement. So what's the big deal, right? It's like, you're just seeing where your body's moving. But I think the challenge is when you start to do the types of sensor fusion, that when you have what you're moving your fingers, but it's in the context of knowing everything that you're in, they know where your body position, they know what you're looking at. And at the IEEE in 2021, there was a paper from Facebook Reality Labs that was about how they created an environment where they were looking at how they were doing head movement and hand pose. but they were also doing that and with other people, and they were able to do a machine learning model that they had eye tracking. So they're able to see where people were actually looking with eye tracking and looking at where their head movement and their hand movement was. So then they were able to take that machine learning model and apply it into a VR headset without any eye tracking, and still, to a very high degree of confidence, understand where people were looking just by looking at their head pose and their hand pose. So with head pose and hand pose, you're able to extrapolate eye gaze. Eye gaze is huge. I mean, that's like the main thing that they want to know is what you're paying attention to, what you're looking at. And if they could create a, this model may be very dependent into that same context. I don't know how generalizable it is, but generally they're probably come up with a way to say when people are moving their hands and pointing at something and they're moving their head in a certain way, they may be able to know what you're looking at. So that gives a larger impulse of this sensor fusion that's happening here, that even individually, if you're only looking at, like, I'm moving my finger like this, what's the big deal? It's just body movement. But when you tie that body movement in with your emotional reactions, with your different ways of mental models of what you may be thinking, and tied with what your intentional actions are in the context of a virtual environment, all that stuff together, they're coming up with a pretty, and they've explicitly said this is what they want to do. They want to do what they call contextually aware AI. Contextually aware AI is aware of your context at all times. And it's your environment, what you're thinking, all this stuff. It's like I don't know if this should be a good design goal. I don't know if I want contextually aware AI. Maybe I want like AI that's only there for when I choose a context that I want it to be, not just consistently, persistently, always aware of what I'm doing and what I'm thinking. Maybe that'll lead into some sort of utopic vision of technology where we just say something in technology knows exactly what we mean. I mean, common sense reasoning within AI is very difficult because it's difficult to understand how to model context in a way of language and the surrounding environments. And even if it was environmentally connected, I could be talking to you about my job and profession, and all of a sudden I could be talking to you about my family, and all of a sudden I've switched context. And like, what is the way that that all of a sudden I'm talking to you, and when I say scripting, that I mean JavaScript and coding, or if right. I'm talking to my brother-in-law who's a screenwriter, that script means like the script he's working on. So even a contextual dimension of contextually aware AI in terms of linguistics and pragmatics means that it's there's contextual dimensions that are like just a turn of a phrase that can change the context. So the idea of having AI that's aware of my context of all moments is extremely dystopic, because it means that it would have to be listening to us to that degree to really understand what that context is. So I think when you also look at the egocentric data capture that would need to be required to be able to train that type of model was part of where they're going with all that stuff. So when you think about like all those different aspects of the being aware of our context and trying to I guess put limits as to where you want to stop some of that stuff from happening. I think the strategy is to try to sorry, I lost the train of thought of the original question.
So my question was why should people care, right?
Oh, right. So the skeptical, okay, I remember, sorry, I lost the thread there. The skeptical argument would be to say that that these are snake oil salesmen, and that what they say they can do, they can't actually do. And even if they could model you to that degree that they want to model you, all that contextually aware, that's the skeptical perspective was like, they're never going to be able to do that. That it's very difficult to do that, even if they could. And so there are going to be limits, and also that we're not, deterministic mathematical entities that are going to be able to be modeled. And then there's the other skeptical arguments that say, well, maybe we don't even have free will. So when we talk about our right to agency, then maybe that's already an illusion that we don't actually have. And so how would you put some boundaries around what already exists in terms of the types of persuasion that we have in our culture, and especially in the context of technology? So there's very pragmatic limits in terms of like, even though these sound like great ideas for what we want, there's difficulty in being able to robustly and specifically define it in a way that is able to, take something as high level as right to agency, right to identity. Identity is very relational. So our context that we're in defines who we are. When we're with our parents, we talk differently than when with our friends, than when we're in a professional context, than when we're in a religious context, than when we're with, a whole, our friends, our romantic partners. Each of these are distinct contexts that, that's difficult to get a good, handle on. So, how would you really robustly define all those in a way that is clear? So that's the challenge of, even if something like the Chile's interpretation of the Neuro-rights is so broad that would basically outlaw all XR technologies, because you're saying you don't want to use any of this brain data for anything at all, which would include, BCIs or XR technologies as we move forward. So, it's important to be able to have that dialectic, those debates, because it's not like they're wrong, but at the same time, to sort of dismissing this outright and saying we're never going to be able to come up with a model, therefore we should do nothing, is kind of like encouraging us to, again, potentially live into a situation that's extremely dystopic. So at what point do you intervene, I think is the challenge.
Mm-hmm. So, I think when talking to Kent Bai and to understand Kent Bai, I feel like your perspective like almost always comes back to your like roots in process philosophy. Like a lot, I feel like if you're able to wrap your head around the difference between process philosophy and substance metaphysics, that's it, right? Those are like the two. So first of all,
it's actually the analytic tradition of philosophy that's based upon substance metaphysics, and the process relational metaphysics is kind of the foundation of process philosophy. So it's like the main strand of philosophy is the analytic tradition. There's also the continental tradition, but those are the two kind of main ones. And I guess mainstream philosophy is, but there's other ones, pragmatism and other kind of non-Western philosophies that are out there as well. But the process philosophy is unique that way.
We're going to keep it here for now with these two, because I feel like people who maybe are new to philosophy or who are just starting to attempt to think from a philosophical perspective, I feel like they almost, and I feel like maybe as like babies, we're almost like defaulted into this like immediate perspective of reality as this like substance-based thing, where like the stuff that I am seeing and encountering is what's real because it's here. I see it every day. Like, I mean, it's, how do you argue with this microphone? Like, here it is. So, but before we dive into that just a little bit, because I do think it really helps to kind of pull it back to this point so we can better understand a lot of these things that we're talking about. I am curious, do you have a definition for philosophy? Like if someone came up and like, you're like, yeah, I like philosophy. And they're like, what's philosophy? Like, what's your, like, explain like I'm 5 definition.
Well, for me, philosophy is a lot about these kind of unspoken worldviews and beliefs about what you personally believe, what the nature of reality is, and your relationship to how you gain knowledge and what you find valuable. It's a way of kind of evaluating all these worldviews and defining them and kind of understanding how to navigate them. Because the thing about philosophy also is that it's non-falsifiable. So it's basically giving you permission to believe a lot of things that have actual great disagreement within the philosophical community. I mean, whether or not we have free will or not, whether or not consciousness is emergent from our physical being, or whether or not it's more of a fundamental field, or whether or not consciousness lives in every little bit of matter that somehow gets pulled together. And what is the nature of reality? Is it the reality only this physical stuff, or is the different types of experiences that we have within VR just as genuine and just as real as anything else outside of VR? And so I think the philosophers have been trying to kind of map out this landscape of these ideas. And from there, on top of that, philosophy has, born out of it science and so many different other practices that started as philosophy, but then eventually maybe evolved into other domains that are from like Newton and the process of science. Science itself has a philosophy of science. So there's underneath it a number of different assumptions that need to be made around how you're going to share knowledge and what knowledge means in a communal process. And the scientific method defines that. But there's alternatives to that in terms of maybe you have personal experiences that can't be falsifiable and it's a one-off. And so that doesn't mean that it's not true. It just means that it's not sort of meeting the same standard of objective science, or you have to use qualitative methods that, there's still ways of getting access to some of that stuff. But it helps you orient like it puts language on these things that allows you to navigate some deep assumptions that people have that they intuitively will make already in terms of their worldviews and their beliefs. And it just gives you a way of not only evaluating where people stand in terms of this long history of philosophical thought, but also, the more you get into philosophy, the more that you sort of are faced to try to really challenge your convictions philosophically, because there's often ways in which that there's a counter argument that you need to also be able to consider. And so it's being able to sit in that tension of the opposites, meaning that you have two competing views and that you almost have to channel switch because they're mutually exclusive oftentimes. You can't believe both at the same time because they contradict each other. And so you have to be able to be like, well, for some contexts, I believe that the nature of reality is made of physical stuff. Like when I get hit by a car, I'm going to go to like the hospital because I'm not going to, challenge the whether or not this car actually exists or whatnot. And it's like, well, you need to go to the hospital, right? There's not a philosophical matter at that point. But there are matters that do end up having, this definition about what's real or what's not real will end up playing forth in terms of what laws are set. This as an example, there's a First Amendment law, there's an interpretation from the Supreme Court around the First Amendment that's established like the fighting words doctrine. That means that when you're face to face with someone and you say something that instigates like violence or something like that, then that's actually not protected free speech, right? If you're face to face and it's what's called fighting words. I don't know how they define the fighting words, but one of the preconditions is that it leads to physical violence, like face to face. But that same type of definition online doesn't carry, and oftentimes the First Amendment's towards the government, right? So if you are somehow in an online context and talking to the government in that same way, or talking to other people, there could be a different context under which that's ruled by the context under which like Meta's website, they have a terms of service, right? And so that would be ruled by them rather than the First Amendment rights. But generally there are sort of protected rights of free speech and then unprotected free speech rights. But that sometimes those protections, they shift based upon whether it's in a virtual context or in a physical context. And I think as we move forward, the value of having a philosophical perspective is that we need to start to define what some of those differences are, because we have to know whether or not some of the existing laws need to be applied in some of these virtual contexts, or new laws need to be applied in these virtual contexts. And the ethical frameworks that help you decide, whether it's the consequentialist, like see what the actions are or the consequences are, whether it's a deontological approach, which is what the rules are and the principles that you're trying to follow, or whether it's a virtue ethics in terms of what virtues you're trying to live into as a human being to kind of like live into some sort of ideals of those principles. Like there's different ethical frameworks even, and that, as we move into the virtual context, how do you decide how to apply these? Because they may be, you may be, let's say, killing a virtual being in a virtual context, which is different than a murder when you kill someone and they're dead. So what's the difference between those two? The philosophical approach forces you to define what's the difference between physical murder and virtual murder, and the different types of virtual violence and physical violence. And then there's the gamer's dilemma, which then sort of whatever you say for how you establish violence, now apply the same exact thinking and rationale to pedophilia and see if you came up with the same answer. And to see, is there a difference in terms of how we react to virtual pedophilia and real pedophilia? Because there's pretty universal dismissing that virtual pedophilia is not okay. And I agree and concur with that. But what's the difference between that and violence? Because then if you say that, then...
One of my favorite questions. This is one of my favorite questions. I have asked people who don't want to be asked that question, that very question.
It's a very uncomfortable question.
It's uncomfortable, but it's
Yeah.
a really important one.
Yeah.
And I guess what you're saying here is that philosophy and being a philosopher is being able to sit into that space and be like, but for real though, what is the difference? And chew on it for a while. And I mean, I guess ultimately discover it, you know? I mean, like, can philosophy come to conclusions on its own, or does something else happen as a result of what philosophy is doing?
There's a lot of debates within the philosophical circles as to whether or not there's been any progress in philosophy since Plato, right? Like, so like there's debates. There's actually debates as to whether or not there is progress. I think that there has been, in the sense of how philosophy often gets translated into other domains and other ways of just even being able to scope out some of these different things. I mean, this new book of Reality Plus, that I got early access to by David Chalmers, it's the Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. It comes out on January 25th, and for anybody who's interested in listening to up to this point, I think you'd really enjoy this as a book, because it's an introductory course to philosophy, while also asking a lot of provocative questions about the nature of VR, while also tying into a lot of pop culture and science fiction, but also, I think, making some original arguments around the nature of reality.
Well,
and whether or not we live in a simulation.
I do want to dive into some of this book, but I do want to make sure that we have a good understanding of our new mental framework, right, as process philosophers. So, we're looking at the idea, and we're talking about philosophy and about reality, like what's real and what's not real, and what's more real or what's less real, and defining what is real, defining what it takes to be real, I think is something that it kind of needs to happen in order to really be able to give any kind of qualitative distinction. When I learned about the Platonic perspective, it's always been something that's resonated deeply with me, and they had such a simple answer. It was just that something that lasts longer is more real than something that doesn't, and then they had their own approach or whatever of kind of determining what it means to last, right? But my understanding at this point is that process philosophy claims that the things that are happening are more real than the objects in which those things are being driven by, or I don't know if I'm saying this the right way, but it's like there's the stuff that's happening and there's the stuff that's doing the stuff that's happening. And process philosophy almost leans more into the stuff that's happening as being more real than the stuff that's bouncing around over here causing it.
Yeah, I guess I'll try to take this from another tracks. I think the substance metaphysics tends to look at the world as these static concrete objects that have properties under them, whereas a process relational approach sees that the world is in dynamic flux and that's constantly changing and shifting, and that it's sort of moving into one thing to the next. And so when you take a kind of an object-oriented approach around consciousness, you can, at the extreme, say that your consciousness is an illusion, that it's just the result of this physical stuff and these neurons firing, and your phenomenal experience of what your experience is not real. It's sort of Descartes had the evil demon. It's the equivalent of having an evil demon that's sort of manipulating you, and that experience of that phenomenal consciousness is an illusion. And because it's an illusion, it's not real. So that's sort of the eliminative materialist perspective. Then there's the physical reductionist approach, which is saying that you do have a consciousness, but it's a neural correlates of the consciousness. So meaning that it's a result of all these brain firings that are happening in your brain, and that's where the consciousness is coming in, even though they haven't been able to kind of find all of the gaps. But that, from their perspective, could be a matter of resolution, that you don't have enough close resolution to see all the firings because there's billions of neurons firing all in sort of ways. It's like an orchestra, and you're trying to reconstruct an orchestra that's happening in a football field and you're 2 miles away. Like you're trying to get into your brain that you don't have full access to the full resolution as to what's happening. So it may be that the physical, like the reductive materialists are correct in that our consciousness is purely a result of all these brain neurons. David Chalmers comes in and says, like, look, Descartes basically created this bifurcation between the mind and the body, saying that the only thing that he knew that could actually exist was his mind, because he didn't know if the external world could actually existed. You know, there could be an evil demon, it could be an illusion, it could be a dream. It's this skepticism about the external world that kind of creates this dualism of like, we know that we have a mental world, but the physical, you know, reality is different. And those are the mind body split. And there's a bifurcation for a long time. But more and more, we have a fusion of the ways in which that they're interacting, and dualism isn't a popular view. However, it does come back in the context of if we're living in a simulation and we have a biological entity that is external to this world, then that could be a mechanism by which that you can think about when you go into a VR experience, how your consciousness feels like in that world, but your physical body's in this world. Maybe that's like as a metaphor for what this kind of like Cartesian dualism is that we have another biological entity outside of this world, and everything that we're experiencing is being purely in the simulated world.
That's the Matrix, right?
Yeah, the Matrix. But the more, I guess, process relational approach kind of, well, there's process relational and David Chalmers. Chalmers says that this is a hard problem, that maybe if you're saying that the nature of reality of all these bits of matter being added together, that's the only thing that you have as your Lego building blocks for reality are these physical matter, then how do you get consciousness? How do you get this phenomenal narrative of your experience out of stuff that would be basically like, why would a pair of bricks have a phenomenal experience? It's just as likely as a bunch of rocks being put together to have a phenomenal consciousness than humans. Then what is that? And so he terms it the hard problem of consciousness, because there's this big leap to try to go from this physical stuff into consciousness. So he says, well, maybe consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the nature of reality. It's a fundamental field that becomes another Lego building block that you can build from. So you have different approaches like pan-experientialism, saying that all of reality is this level of experience. Panpsychism, which says that every little bit of matter has a little bit of consciousness that's added together when you put it all together. And so the issue of consciousness is one catalyst to something like a process relational approach. Because process is all about, like, you think about when you go into a VR experience, you have a frame rate, right? So there's a way in which that there's 90 frames a second. It's sort of a loop that's iterating, right? And then from there, you have the haptics that you have, which is like 1 to 2 milliseconds or something like that, that you can feel things that are very, very, I think our touch is like the most sensitive when it comes to that. And then you have the sight at a certain frequency, and then you have your hearing. So you have all these senses that are happening at different perceptual loops, and it's all being fused together somehow magically through percepts that we're able to then, through the predictive coding model of neuroscience, be able to have a model of the world, and then basically take all that sensory input and then fuse it together and create new models of the world. So our brain is sort of functionally a prediction machine that is iterating. It's constantly updating what that new model of reality is. So that's part of the catalyst to say that, you know, in order to really understand some of these basic fundamental things, you have to take that more iterative process approach, because that's sort of the way that we understand the world through consciousness. But it could go down to the layer of reality, meaning that you have quantum events that are happening in some sort of potentia, and then somehow from those potentia is collapsing into reality. So there's a lot of the main theories around quantum mechanics for the small, and then the general relativity for the big. So how do you match the big and the small together? And that's been basically the grand unified theory that's been the physics folks have been chasing for a long, long time. These are two different mass structures. You can think of it as like pseudo-Riemannian structure here for 4D space-time. And then you have like, you know, an infinite dimension Hilbert space that is quantum mechanics. And so how do those two mass structures combine? What a lot of folks think is that what's most likely is that space-time's emergent out of the quantum substrate. So you have an infinite dimension Hilbert space or whatever it ends up being, and then it sort of collapses into a metrical space-time. So what we're seeing are these objects, but what processes philosophy is saying is that there's actually things that come before those objects. And those are those processes that are unfolding, that are in the realm of potential. And then from that potential, that you can see these objects as more of a continuation of processes that are unfolding, rather than a static object that is concrete and unmutable. Everything is sort of like lives and dies. Nothing lasts forever. And there's different scales of these processes that are unfolding. The Earth is unfolding at a certain scale. Mm-hmm. We're unfolding at a certain scale. Our consciousness moment.
In one of your talks, you showed this like pool with like all of the water like rumbling and like resonating and like kind of like sloshing together a little bit, and that was being used to illustrate like the potential, you know, and like all of the everything. And then it's when those waves kind of collide and shoot some water up in the middle, like that is like the tangible reality or whatever, you know, the experiences, you know, that we happen to see. And it's like I thought that did a good job of kind of illustrating, you know, like here's like the everything kind of sitting underneath the surface, you know, like existing, sure, but not exactly what is being perceived, I guess. And then these things kind of happen to collide and shoot up these little spurts up that kind of come up above the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, that was called the concentric wave singularity, which was basically a pool that was a circular pool, and you have these things resonating at a certain frequency, and then eventually you're able to create a 90-foot wave of water from all these waves adding together. So you have constructive and destructive interference with waves, and so the idea as a metaphor that at a layer of kind of the quantum substrate is sort of, you can think of it as frequency domains as ways of these waves of potential. This potentia are basically a possibility of what's possible. And what process philosophy, what Whitehead was trying to make this differentiation between what is actual and what is possible, and the sort of potentia. And there's a couple of different quantum mechanics interpretations. One is the Foundations of Relational Realism by Epperson and Zefiris, and the other is by Ruth Kastner about a transactional approach. And both of those are trying to essentially say that, like, a lot of, you know, a naturalistic approach would say that the only thing that's real is metrical spacetime, meaning there's no kind of like supernatural non-local fields of, you know, beyond space and time. Like there's nothing beyond space-time. But there's certain anomalies within quantum dynamics when it comes to quantum entanglement that has this kind of spooky action at a distance, meaning that there's entities that are communicating with each other in some way, that there's information exchange between them where they're kind of correlated in a way that goes beyond the distance of the speed of light, meaning that is kind of violating some fundamental principles of what we understand the limits of metrical spacetime is. The speed of light is a hard limit. You can't go faster. But non-local quantum entanglement is violating that. So there's certain ways in which if you only say that we have the substance is the only thing that's real, there's nothing beyond space-time, you have to answer, well, explain these kind of quantum anomalies. And so it's from those quantum anomalies that you have these interpretations from quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics is understood mathematically for a long time in terms of what these equations are saying. The challenge is, what does it mean? What's the deeper story for what's happening with those equations? And I think that's part of the challenge of most of the meaning-making structures have been set within the substance metaphysics framework, meaning that when you look at it, it's incomprehensible because it doesn't make any sense for what is essentially a kind of Boolean logic, meaning that anything can be true or false, but you can't have the cat alive and dead at the same time. Right. The Schrodinger's cat is a famous example. And so that's sort of a Boolean logic that we have. But the non-Boolean logic is ways in which that there's many possibilities that are kind of superimposed on top of each other. And that's sort of the superposition and the complementary nature of the wave-particle duality, that you don't know what is happening until you measure it. But they're basically both things happening at once until you create a context under which that you collapse it. So that's another big thing around process philosophy, is establishing the importance of context, that it's not just input-output. Like we like to say, like, this is an object, this is me, and that's the object. That's basically like this dyad. But what's important about quantum mechanics is that you can never have an input and output in absence of a context. So it's a triadic, it's a move towards a triad. So you have to implement the context in order to have any quantum measurement. And in a book, Timothy Eastman's Untying the Gordian Knot, he's making the argument that triadic relationship of context is actually expanding to all of reality, that you can't understand reality absence of the context. And the problem with reductive materialism is it often tries to collapse that context and try to turn things down into sort of a reductive set of numbers. But always, even when you do that, it's always within the context of something that is being often ignored. And so that's why I think Whitehead has this concept of mereology, which is trying to establish these wholes and parts and try to create with a math structure that allows you to have this kind of nested sequence of things that are kind of within each other. And it's within that nested sequence that the wholes and parts where the kind of the mass structure of process lives. meaning that there's large processes that are unfolding and then smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller processes. So given that as a math kind of metaphor, it helps you to understand things like privacy, things like the relationship between our culture and our laws and our the economic aspects and the technological architectures, all the things I was talking about before, are sort of nested into these nested mereological whole parts of our of reality, but that it ends up being a very useful frame when looking at quantum ontology, because category theory is another example of a relational approach to mathematics. Set theory is more of the kind of the more object-oriented approach, and the category theory is more structuralist or relational. So a lot of this more relational approaches of the foundations of relational realism is using like sheaf theory and category theory to establish the local context and the global context, and to see how there's different ways in which those two contexts are related to each other through the math structures of category theory, which are more robust than, say, trying to reduce things down into like a Boolean logic. So category theory is proving to be very fruitful in terms of maybe providing the foundations of mathematics, but it's also got this kind of inherent, they call it the algebra of relationships. And so it's got a relational approach. That when I was talking to David Chalmers, he was talking about structuralism as his big thing is that, nature of reality is sort of structuralism in this book. But I think the structuralism in terms of math is a category theory. And underneath that, I say maybe there's a deeper process relational approach that's even below the kind of structure. So you have the processes, and then you have the structure, and then you have all of the reality.
Nice. Sometimes I feel like I am in a reality that is a 5-sensory perception prison. It's like, I'm like, oh, wait a second. Like, my context for this conversation and for every conversation I've ever had is based on what my ears, eyes, nose, mouth, and nerves can tell me, and I often dream and imagine of shit that's flying around in this room right now that I don't have a sensory perception organ for. And if I did, and if it existed, and if I did have the ability to interpret that, in what ways would that kind of shatter my current perspective of reality or my current understanding of things? And I'm just curious, have you ever think about this kind of stuff from that perspective of we're kind of I feel very limited in my ability to comprehend this, and it's almost like, I don't know, that I'm missing a lot of tools to be able, things that are measurable, to be able to kind of dedicate myself to any one way of looking at things.
Well, I mean, the way that David Chalmers talks about this in his book is that he uses the metaphor of a simulation theory, to if you have a lot of very strong commitments about the nature of reality, then he sort of, as a thought experiment, provokes you into this series of questions of okay, well, do you think we live in a simulation? Yes or no? If you have an absolute hard no, there's absolutely no way. Well, then what about this? Can you prove philosophically that we're not in a simulation? And then when you step through that, then you have to kind of step through oh boy, well, let's see, if we were in a perfect simulation, if there was in the simulation the Matrix, where there was glitches in the Matrix, then we'd be able to find one of those glitches, right? Or maybe they'd be the creator of this simulation would be able to show us a source code and be able to have these supernatural powers that would be clear evidence that we have it. But in the absence of having that, if we're in a perfect simulation, there's no positive information that we can know for sure or not whether we're not in a simulation. So then we're stuck with, well, if we're in a perfect simulation, then there's no way to prove that we're not in a simulation. And then you have to sort of accept that we might be in a simulation already. And then I think in this book, what Chalmers does is saying, okay, given that, let's reevaluate all these philosophical arguments. Oh, you said that there's absolutely no God. Well, what if you live in a simulation? Then there's going to be some sort of godlike entity. Well, what does that change your view of whether or not there was a creator, or whether or not there was a demiurge, as he calls it in the book? So he sort of goes through, and then at the end, he goes into the foundations, where he's really trying to abstract out, Descartes kind of put this challenge in the world that the external world doesn't exist. And it's been a problem in the philosophy for hundreds of years, that there's been no comprehensive philosophical argument to prove for sure that the external world exists, Because all of this could be a solipsistic world where everything's being constructed, like we're in the Truman Show, right? And all of you are AI beings, and that I'm being manipulated by some sort of like evil demon-like entity, but in this virtual simulation that feels so real, but it's at this kind of perfect level. So you kind of go through these different stages of trying to break down, like, okay, is the underlying nature of reality, is it substance? Is it these digital ones and zeros if we are in a simulation? And then if it's one, or is it these math structures that are there? Or is it consciousness? Or what I would throw in there is that there's elements of process. And so you're faced with trying to have limited access. You don't have complete access to the non-spatial temporal realm. You can't have direct access to these platonic forms if they are in this ideal realm. And so you're faced with what Chalmers talks about here is this Kantian humility, meaning that you have limits in terms of what you can and cannot know about the full nature of reality. You can only have a certain limits to what you can know about the world through your senses and all the other methods of using science even. So there's going to be a hard limit about what you can absolutely know for sure. And then there's always going to be like maybe one layer below that where we have to make a series of assumptions that's just beyond what you can perceive or not perceive. And maybe through VR, we'd be able to train ourselves to be able to see these kind of extrasensory perceptions. I mean, maybe we'll unlock different aspects of precognition or psychic abilities. I mean, who knows what's possible with the latent human potentials that we have seen indications of from the literature, from different, like researchers like Dean Radin has been looking at this from the Institute of Neuro-rights Sciences and has written a number of books looking into different evidence here. But that's all speculative in terms of this type of latent human potential. What we do know is that we have limits to our perception, and that we have to, at that point, make a series of philosophical assumptions. And those series of assumptions, there's a lot of those assumptions, but some of those assumptions lead to certain outcomes. And I think part of my leaning away from substance metaphysics is because there's ways in which that we've reductively treated the world and kind of like subject-object in a way that we're essentially leads to destroying the planet because we're not in right relationship to the world around us. We've kind of abstracted that out. Like we can extract these objects away from our relationship to the world around us. Whereas the process relational says that relation is the most important thing, and that we need to be not only relationship to the world around us and to the earth around us and to ourselves, but also to other people. And to look at through that lens of relationship as being the ultimate nature of reality, is that because there's these quantum substrates beneath these substances that we don't quite understand, but we can at least have enough math structures to indicate that there's something that goes deeper than that, in that non-spatial, temporal, non-local realm. And as Chalmers says in this book, we could be 42 layers deep into the simulation. We don't know like what that base reality is. We could be incepted into like many, 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 many different layers of that. And the only thing we can see is our simulation or our world, our reality, and then a little bit of some indication of one layer below us that we can see some artifacts from, but not completely. Mm-hmm. And so, that's the philosophical journey, is to like figure out what your commitments are and to evaluate each of those different possibilities. And I think that's why the Chalmers' book, Reality Plus, is so effective, is because he kind of steps you through that, like step by step, using VR, but also using kind of like an intro to philosophy framing to kind of like take you through that journey to be able to kind of maybe build up some of that capacity of understanding what you're really committed to. And I read the book and I changed my mind about stuff, and I wasn't expecting that to happen, but that's the kind of power.
It seems like this book kind of made some waves for you. I feel like you got a little bit excited about this one, which I think is amazing. Like, what is it? Like, what I mean, what is it about this that stands out the most that you think has kind of made the biggest impact?
Well, Chalmers really contextualizes VR within the larger historical philosophical debates that have been happening for hundreds of years. So he's contextualizing VR and saying that these are genuine realities, which is not the normal view. The normal view is like from Mel Slater's view, saying the place illusion, the plausibility illusion, the virtual body ownership illusion, that these are illusionary. But one of the things that Chalmers says is that for expert users, they don't feel like they're being tricked. They just feel like this is their reality when they're in these immersive worlds. So a lot of the origination of these kind of language around illusions was done in the context of academia, that people didn't have VR headsets in their home. And so when they're walking into the lab, they're being tricked because they're not doing it day after day after day. But anybody who's a sufficient, regular user of VR knows that these experiences are just as genuine and real as any other physical experiences. The limit with some of the different limits around haptics and everything else. Obviously, there's going to be things that are inclusive and exclusive, which he starts to talk about here in the book. But on the whole, the different ways of which taking action, or with our intentional action, our agency, being able to have mental and social presence, being able to have emotional presence and connection to other people, and to be able to have a sense of embodiment within these worlds. And that when you add all those things together, that's kind of the core of what it means to have experiences, and to those experiences get encoded in your brain as memories that are almost indistinguishable as experiences that happen in the physical reality. Yeah. And so then it challenges you to think about, well, what is real? If these objects feel real, these events feel real, these are meaningful experiences, these experiences and people that I having interactions with, they feel just as real. And so then it becomes a philosophical question of trying to interrogate, okay, what is it about your metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality that maybe needs to shift around how you define what reality is? And I think it's a compelling argument that I think I think it'll make waves within the larger philosophical and also community, who I think generally at large, the general public still sees virtual reality as a form of illusion. And then that it's sort of a bad path just de facto to go down, because there's been thought experiences about the experience machine would be basically creating all of these amazing experiences in VR forever. But that when you actually get in, the way that it's framed is not like VR. We have agency and action, and you can hang out with other people. It's basically like you go get stimulated into like this world where you're all by yourself. You can't decide what you want to see, and all these ways of framing the experience machine that puts virtual reality into this area that is not desirable and is best and essentially de facto bad because it's illusionary and fake and not real. So it's I think countering this larger narrative that we have in our culture in a way that's really philosophically grounded, but also like challenging people's metaphysical assumptions about what the reality is. Because there's no way that you can prove that we're not in a simulation, that kind of opens up the door as to the different types of metaphysical frameworks you could start to adopt. For me, I'm an advocate for one that is a minority, which is the process relational view. And there's ways in which that process relational view can kind of slot into this like structuralist view that Chalmers is taking. It's like maybe there's process, maybe structure, and then there's the the reality that we can observe. So he calls it the X from or the bit from structure from X. So there's structures that we can see, the math structures, and that from X means that there could be any number of things that are even below the structure that we don't have access to. And I think that's what Whitehead was trying to say in terms of his process relational approach, is kind of intuiting that there is this deeper impulse beneath those structures, which are these processes that are unfolding.
Beautiful. So what are dreams? What's a dream?
I think the dreams are a way for you. I mean, Jung and Freud had a lot of aspects of analyzing the dreams. And what I see is that it's the psyche's way of taking unconscious processes that are happening and trying to give you a story that's trying to provoke you into these deeper archetypal dynamics that your soul is trying to evolve in some fashion, you could say. And that's who are we and why we're here. We're souls here that are trying to evolve and grow. And the dreams are a portal that if you read it through a lens to be able to see the meaning of that, then you can maybe unlock some secret messages. And that's sort of the Jungian approach of Freud and Jung. Freud kind of pioneered a lot of that. And the Jungian approach, takes that as these messages from your deep aspects of your unconscious. I've been involved in the men's retreats where we would wake up in the morning and we would have a dream cabin and people would share their dreams. So then you tell the dream what happened in the dream. And then you say, what does that dream mean? What does it mean for you? What do the symbols mean for you? And then you get asked questions by the audience trying to provoke different aspects of the dream. And when you say the dream, you say exactly what happened. There's no meaning. Just say what happened. Look at the meaning layer. You then get interrogated. And then you have it sort of open to try to look at the larger universal myths to try to interpret whether or not it's a personal myth or a universal myth. There's some combination there, but it's a language of the soul's. It's the images are the language of the soul, and so when you have those language, those those insights, it could be giving you messages of trying to unlock deeper aspects. Or another illusionary thing is it's all just random brain firing. Doesn't mean anything.
I don't know, dude. I feel like I just feel like I go somewhere new. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I quintessentially remain the same, regardless of whether or not I'm like here having this conversation with you or I'm in a dream having this conversation with you. I feel like my behavior doesn't change too much, you know? And I don't know, to me, it reminds me of VR in a lot of ways. When I did the meta movie, it felt like I was in a dream. You did the meta movie, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lucid dreaming and dreaming. I mean, this is an area where I think as we move forward, just talked to Joe Hunting, who spent 8 hours a day for a year filming in VR for a movie that's premiering at Sundance called We Met in Virtual Reality. And he said that he was dreaming in his context was in VR, and the people he was interacting with were the avatars. And so I think there's a way in which that we take what's happening in our lives and we start to work it out in different ways. I'm a fan of the Jungian approach, and I do think there can be ways in which that there are things that can be hidden messages that can be unlocked. But sometimes it takes a community to help unlock those things. So yeah, but the question of essential character, whether or not you change over time, like what parts of you, there's a quote from Kierkegaard that says that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So you may not know until what was essential to your character until you're on your deathbed. And that you can, when you look back, you could say, this is the thing that was definitely immutable and a part of your essential character. And that's the challenge of like understanding the story of who you are and why you're here, because your life has to be lived forwards, and there's realms of potential that are unrealized, and that you have to understand how to navigate those realms of potential. And I think that's what VR does, is it creates these opportunities of these realms of potential to be able to create this context for you to make choices and take action. And there's a question as to whether or not you're able to be enough pressure to simulate the actual situation to reveal an essential part of your character. That's a Robert McKee quote that I use a lot. So yeah, it's a question though, that we may not have essential parts of our character. We may be these processes that are continually in dynamic flux, and that what we see as static is only static in this moment, but over time it may change.
Well, this is so good. Thanks for answering that question, by the way. Might have felt a little out of left field, but I felt like it was relevant. We're about to pull the plug on this thing pretty hard. But before we go, I want to ask one last question, and it's that, what for you, if you could say, if you're looking back on your contributions, right, to the space, these conversations, these thought processes, your work in philosophy and ethics and all of that, what would be the thing that you could say that you did that made you feel good about what you've done? What's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish here?
Well, I think there's from indigenous perspective, they look forward 7 generations. So when I think about 7 generations from now, that I hope that the work that I'm producing now will be able to give insights into what happened, but ideally what's happening now, to be able to help guide and direct where this is all going. There was a time in my life where there's some things that could have happened that put me on a very different path, and I had a dream about being able to travel and talk to all these different people and put things out into the world. And so I hope that, at the end of the day, that people look back at the body of the work that I've been able to produce, and to be able to get either some deep insight about what the essential character of this medium is, and then maybe even learn more about themselves. I mean, the ultimate potential of VR for me is to learn more about yourself, the more about your relationships with other people, the more about your relationship to the planet, and more about relationships to all dimensions of reality. So I think that my work sort of carries that thread of this inquiry for me to learn more about myself, for other people to learn about other people, for you to learn how to be in right relationship to the earth. Because if we're not in right relationship to the earth, we will destroy ourselves. And then there's a lot of questions for what needs to happen in order to be in right relationship to the earth. And then to be open-minded about all dimensions of reality, because there's so many things that we don't know. There's more things that we don't know than we do know in the long scope of history. So holding the tension of the opposites and being able to sit with those paradoxes of not knowing and sitting with those opposite things together, I think, I try to loosen up people's minds whenever I can in terms of any fixed ways that they think that this is absolutely the way the world works. So being able to sit with that paradox, I think, is one of the skills that we need in our 21st century. I think VR helps do that. And I hope that there's many different contexts that we're going to be able to understand. There's different ethical frameworks that put forth, different experiential design frameworks and experiential immersive storytelling. So just trying to come up with this potential of being able to experience anything that you want, that VR is an experience machine. So let's create experiences that are in harmony with where we want to be as a humanity, with more connected to ourselves, more connected to other people, connected to the earth, and connected to all dimensions of reality.
Dude, thank you so much. Thank you for everything that you have said here in the past couple of hours, and thank you for coming on and being a part of our community and being on our show for the third time now. Your time means the world to us. We are huge fans, and we will continue to be. And I'm grateful to have the time to sit here and connect and to ask these kinds of questions with you. So we really, really appreciate you, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on again. It's always fun to dig into these things. Like I said, you guys are both really deep listeners, and it's always knowledge comes out whenever you ask questions like that, and the relational. It creates a context for sharing of my own experiences, and I say things in a way that I've never said them before. So it's always fun to be able to talk to you all and that deep listening, and we all want to have some legacy in our lives. And so, putting stuff out in the world, and
my legacy is going to be having Kent By on my show. I had Kent By on my show 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. As long as we're doing this show, you're going to have a seat here on the Between Reality shit.
Heck yeah.
So we normally kick our guests off, but I think you should just ride this one into the sunset with us here. I think at this point, that's what's most appropriate. Sure. So Skiva, how about you just let us know what we are doing next week?
Sure. So next week we actually have 2 episodes happening since we took a break. We're going to ramp it up a little bit here. So our first guest will be on Wednesday, and it will be Joanna Popper from Hewlett Packard. We did have to reschedule her from before, and so she's going to come on and tell us about, what's going on at HP, what's happening with the Reverb G2. We'll get into some hardware and the future of what HP holds for virtual reality.
Dang, Joanna Popper on Wednesday.
Yep.
Dude, this week, holy shit. This is crazy, man. We got Kent By on Friday and Joanna Popper on Wednesday, and all of you amazing people every day in our chat. Ashley, Chris, D1360 VR, Quick Cosplay, Nicole, I saw you in there. Matt Fontana, my homie, I saw you in there. Ashley, person, Vivian, I saw you sliding in here at the end. Chroma Mike Newton, Mepper was here. Dude, so many. Traveling Man was here. Space Roach.
Thank you so
Chris, much. Dude, thank you guys all so much for joining us. We are pulling the plug on this episode now because people have places to go and things to do, but we love you all so much. Thank you for watching the show with us, and we will see you on Wednesday with Joanna Popper.
All right. See you later, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.